Jesus was eternal. John 1:1 and John 1:14 tells us that Jesus existed long before Mary, long before Joseph, long before his earthly ancestors, because he is part of the triune God. He always existed. And so if Jesus Christ was conceived and born like any other baby, then he could not be God. So he had to have a different type of birth. And that's why Mary had to be a virgin. So what does the Bible say? And it says here, in the beginning, this is John, the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's one of the reasons why we believe in the Trinity. The Word was God. And then when we get down to verse 14, it says, so the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. So finally here in verse 14, we see that John explains 1:1 and says, I've been talking about Jesus. Jesus always existed, and so he had to come from heaven into a womb, and then I'll talk about in a minute how that came about, how he was born, all right? So by the miracle of the Holy Spirit, Jesus was conceived in the womb of Mary, a virgin. And so if he would have been born just like you and I, he wouldn't have been God, because it would have been a male and a female conception there. And so we see here a couple of things about Mary and Joseph. Here in Luke, it talks about Mary's story, and Matthew talks about Joseph's story. So an angel comes to Mary and says, you're going to get pregnant. And she wants to know, well, how? I've never been with a guy. How can I get pregnant? And he says, the Holy Spirit is going to come on you. And after the angel, Gabriel, explains this to Mary, Mary responded, I am the Lord's servant. May everything you have said about me come true. Then the angel left her. Okay? And so what we see here is that Mary accepts God's path for her, but she also knows this is going to be a problem. And it is a problem. And we don't dwell enough on how big of a problem this is. It causes a private scandal. It's a private scandal. And so we see here in Matthew now goes to Joseph. And Matthew says this is how Jesus the Messiah was born. His mother Mary was engaged to be married to Joseph. We've talked about this before, that they are betrothed. And a betroth is an engagement, and it's basically the parents have prearranged the marriage. And when you're betrothed, we would say engaged, you are connected with this person. Everybody knows that you're marrying this person, but they basically live apart for a year. They have no relations for a year, just to make sure that when she comes into the relationship, she's pure and she's not with child, and then they come together. The only way, this is such a serious thing, the only way to break this engagement is through a divorce. You would have to write out papers of divorce to separate an engagement. In our culture, we break engagements all the time, and yet there's no divorce and nobody ever thinks anything. People move on. Back then, you didn't move on. It was a big deal. And so it says that she was to be married to Joseph, but before the marriage took place, while she was still a virgin, she became pregnant through the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, this is where it gets fascinating to me. Verse 19 says, Joseph, to whom she was engaged, was a righteous man and did not want to disgrace her publicly, so he decided to break the engagement quietly. So here's what we know just from that verse. Mary comes and says, I got to tell you something. I'm pregnant, and it's God. How do you think that went over? It didn't go over. Joseph doesn't believe her. I don't know about you, but if I was going to marry a woman, she tells me she's pregnant, and she said, I have been chosen by God, and he got me pregnant. I'm not buying it. Joseph didn't buy it. What I love about this is Joseph is not some gullible guy. that just fell for it. But he's a good man. And what we see here is he shows grace and justice to Mary. One is he does it quietly. He could have made a big deal. He could have soiled her reputation. He could have went around and said, I was going to marry this girl, and she went and got pregnant, and she won't tell me who the guy is. He could have done that, but he didn't. But at the same time, he's not buying her story. He's not saying this is true. And so Joseph is showing grace and justice to Mary.